that we use in psychology when we talk about positive short-term stress. So when I say eustress, I'm mostly referring to stress that kind of acts like a healthy workout for your brain.
And the reason behind calling it so is to say that it's okay to fail, to normalize failure, and to unlearn the conditioning that makes us think about failure in certain ways.
Eustress has been found that it can actually make your body, which is kind of crazy, the studies they found that short bursts of healthy stress can actually make your body resistant or more resistant to infections. Comfort zones are a trap for the brain. So there's a lot of research out there that has already shown that our brain doesn't know the difference between anxiety and excitement. It's the same type of hormones. My heart is pumping faster to give me energy. My stomach is fluttering because I care about doing well. Mistakes are data, they're not disasters.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Stories and Stanza. And today I have Sylvia Rusan with me, who is a psychologist from London. Hi, Sylvia. Welcome to Stories and Stanza. How are you doing today?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited and I love your podcast. So I'm very happy and excited and grateful to be here.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and I look forward to hearing from you. Today we have a very interesting subject for discussion, which is about good stress or eustress. But before we get to the actual discussion, first of all, for our listeners, would you like to give a brief introduction?
Yes, of course. So when we talk about stress, there's always this negative connotation to it. And don't get me wrong, they're right. Stress is not good. However, most of the time when people say stress is not good, they're referring strictly to chronic stress. Stress has been around, since, our prehistoric brains. It's a very helpful function that we have in our body that helped us, always to go into fight or flight and escape danger. Eustress is a term that we use in psychology when we talk about positive short-term stress. So when I say eustress, I'm mostly referring to stress that kind of acts like a healthy workout for your brain. So it could be, the butterflies that you have in your stomach before a big presentation, or racing heart when sometimes you step, into a sports field, or the excitement like that, that jittery excitement that is mixed with focus and energy. And that's what we call eustress. So the kind of stress that motivates you. And it's kind of the opposite of what we call in psychology and in neuroscience of distress, which is the negative stress, where the one that you don't want, basically.
Perfect. Yeah. Thanks for explaining that. And for our listeners who have joined for the first time, just briefly, we call this segment in our podcast Fail With Me. And the reason behind calling it so is to say that it's okay to fail, to normalize failure, and to unlearn the conditioning that makes us think about failure in certain ways. So basically, whatever we're putting in the box and labeling that as failure, so open that and understand what it is. So the first thing I'd like to hear from you is, how does that idea fail with me, the context and the name of the podcast, sit with you?
So I think, especially from a psychological perspective and a neuroscience perspective, there's many studies that show that failure in general tends to lead to more resilience, when you bounce back. Now, I do want to be cautious here when I say this, because I don't mean failure that is traumatic, God forbid. I am not talking about trauma. I am talking about the type of failure, for example, at work, when a project has not gone to plan, when you might receive, for example, some constructive feedback or things like that. It's from a psychological perspective, there's so many studies that show that if you manage to reframe that in your mind and adopt what we call a growth mindset, it actually ends up motivating you and increasing your resilience and your recovery. And there's many concepts in psychology that we have that help with this. We've got psychological flexibility that is part of acceptance and commitment therapy, or it's called at work acceptance and commitment training. We've got the perspective from neuroscience. We have many other theories, and such as self-determination theory, that show how much of a difference it makes to our brains and to our health and to just general health. I'm not even talking about physical health, just mental health as well. How much of a difference it makes when we're able to reframe failures in our mind. And I think that's something that a lot of people and a lot more people need to understand and need to try to do, because it changes your life dramatically, when you, instead of seeing, a task like, oh my God, I can't do this, and then trying to reframe it and thinking that's a challenge for me, I'm excited about it. It's just the process in the brain is the same, but it's the perception of it that changes, and it gives you a very different type of internal intrinsic motivation, basically.
That is fantastic. I love how you said reframing, because that is in a way what I am trying to create here. Have a positive space where people feel supported, where they can come and listen to a discussion and they feel part of it, they can relate to it and possibly get something as a takeaway from that discussion. And today we are going to understand eustress, and we are going to compare that with distress. And I'm sure that there is a certain amount of reframing there. So that kind of flows on to what we try to do in this series in my podcast. So I'm looking forward to it. So to understand this a little bit better, can you talk about the core differences between distress and eustress? Because when we think stress, we immediately think about something negative, that this is not good. It is, oh, I am stressed, that means that there's something wrong is about to happen. So where is our reframing in that space? Where can it come handy?
I love this question because it's such a good question. And you're absolutely right that, as you said, a lot of people, as soon as we feel stressed, we think, oh my God, that this is not good, I shouldn't feel stressed. But it's not realistic. It's, in the world that we live in today, you are going to be stressed about things. And the way that I explain it, and the way that I also explain it to my students when I talk about stress, and I particularly give a lecture about stress and immunity, I try to open the discussion by telling them that think about it from an evolutionary perspective. Yes. So nothing that doesn't make sense for our survival would have made it through evolution. So, we see this with many other species, and we see it with humans, and everything that the genes that make it through evolution and through survival have a purpose. So when you start thinking about it like this, you realize that actually stress must have a purpose. Otherwise, we wouldn't have it anymore. And it's a delicate balance when it comes to stress, especially when it comes to our health and especially when it comes to our immunity. Short-term stress, so eustress, has been shown to give your immune system a helpful boost, whereas long-term stress or chronic stress can actually gradually wear it down. So there's many studies that show the effect of short-term stress versus chronic stress on things such as autoimmune disorders, inflammations, things like arthritis, high blood pressure, arteriosclerosis, things like that. So stress is seen. Sorry, let me rephrase that. Chronic stress is very much the silent killer, which is what we call it. Okay. Because its effects, although they're very gradual, it's not something that you see from one day to another, are really damaging. Now, when it comes to the contrast between eustress and distress, eustress has been found that it can actually make your body, which is kind of crazy, the studies they found that short bursts of healthy stress can actually make your body resistant or more resistant to infections for a certain time. And the way that I explain this to my students is, again, from an evolutionary perspective, because when we used to have to get out of danger, and we go into that fight or flight mode, what happens on top of the fact that all of our blood flows to our extremities and then to our lungs and our heart, that makes us run or fight or whatever happens. What's also been shown is that in that moment, if we get an injury, we actually have more white blood cells going to that injury, and they go there quicker and we heal quicker. So that was an incredible finding, because if you think about it again from an evolutionary perspective, it doesn't make much sense for us to escape, I don't know, a lion or whatever chasing us in prehistoric times and then get hurt and then die. That doesn't make much sense. So really, some studies show that this acute healthy burst of stress not only saves us from danger, or used to save us from danger, but it would also heal us quicker. Now, this, of course, was millions of years ago, and now, we are cursed, I would say, with what other species don't have, which is anxiety, which is the fear of the future. You won't see, I have a neuroscientist friend who always says that you won't see a zebra after being chased by a lion stress about escaping and then stress about the fact that the zebra was just being chased by a lion. It just goes back to eating grass. Unfortunately, humans, we have been plagued with anxiety, so thoughts about the future. And that's not something that other species have. And the problem with this is that instead of going from that health stress and then go back to normal, we stay in a prolonged activation of stress, and we get too much cortisol. And that's when stress becomes chronic. That's when it becomes the silent killer, because cortisol is it's the stress hormone, but it is the number one killer of brain cells. So that's what it does. It literally kills brain cells. We eliminate cortisol through bodily fluids, and that's completely normal. But there's other ways as well that we can also eliminate cortisol to kind of reduce the risk of it literally killing our brain cells. And this is where research on eustress comes in. So the way that it works is, I can send you the image and we can put it on screen. So imagine kind of like the bell curve, right? So you've got, it's called the Yerkes-Dodson curve in this case. So you've got the bell curve.
If you want to share it, you can do that.
Let's see. Right. Can you see this?
Yes, it's there.
Wait.
I can see it.
Right. Okay. So look at this curve. Okay. So we have performance on this side, and we've got arousal on the y-axis, the x and y-axis. And basically, if you're here, right? So in this part where arousal is low and performance is weak, this is where you're typically bored. you're not interested, you are not performing. Think of this as you are on a Sunday evening, you are sat on the couch and you don't feel like doing anything and you're just there, you're relaxing. And this is great. This is where you are in that moment. And when you want to recover, then this is where you want to be. However, if you stay in this part very often on the left-hand side, there's no productivity. There's no innovation. This is your comfort zone, and comfort zones are a trap for the brain. And then the curve slightly goes up. I don't know if can you see my cursor as well?
Yes, right. I can.
So it goes up and we reach this optimal arousal and performance. And this here in the middle, this is eustress. This is where you want to be. This is that stress, that you get that emotion that you get when you're energized, when you're motivated. When, for example, before you do a presentation, before public speaking, this is the stress that gets you going, that gives a boost to your brain. This is eustress. You want to be here in this zone. And then the danger, what I was talking about, distress, is what happens on the right-hand side of the curve as we go down. So when arousal or stress becomes very high and performance also drops. And this is what happens when you're overwhelmed. So when you have, for example, a lot of work to do and you get lost in it, when you think that you can't face up to the challenges, when it's too much, this is chronic stress on the right hand side of the axis. This is where it starts to become damaging. So too little, you're not performing. You're just bored, you're relaxing, which is great if you want to recover. Too much, and this is where it becomes damaging. And if you stay in this part on the right-hand side for too much, then this is where you start having problems. So we want to stay in this optimal arousal and optimal performance space. And it's been shown that it's basically, to give you a clear number, it's around 100 minutes. Now, it can be 100 minutes per day, so an hour or two of optimal arousal and performance. Or it doesn't have to be every day. Obviously, we don't all have presentations every day. We don't speak in public every day. But it's around 100 minutes of positive arousal. And this is eustress. This is a visual diagram of eustress. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you for the visual diagram as well. And anyone who is watching the episode, I guess it'll make more sense to them. But I will get the image from you later and we can put it in as a link in the episode description for anyone who is just listening to the audio version. Thank you for explaining it so well. Just for my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong. So are we saying that eustress and distress both, like chemically, is the same set of neurotransmitters, same sort of stress hormones, but it is at it's beyond the threshold we are calling it, we are identifying it to negatively impact us, whereas before that threshold it is actually augmenting our capability. Is that what we are saying?
You are absolutely spot on. So there's a lot of research out there that has already shown that our brain doesn't know the difference between anxiety and excitement. It's the same type of hormones. It's the same with physical versus psychological pain. The brain processes physiological pain in the same region that it processes psychological pain. This is why you get physiological symptoms when you're upset. The brain doesn't know to make the difference between them. It's the same set of hormones. What makes the difference, the critical difference, is the length and your perception of it. Because what we need to understand is that what might be extremely stressful for me and what might be distress for me might be eustress for you. So this is why it's a very personal thing. And when I talk to clients and when I talk to my students and I give them techniques to transform this to go from distress to eustress, I tell them that it's very personal to them. I can give them 20 techniques, but only one or two might work for them. So it's not only the duration, but what matters most is your perception. It's the stress mindset that we have, because it's the same thing for the brain.
That's very well said. I'm just still processing what we have discussed so far, and I find that so very interesting. And from what I have understood, like when we get this burst of neurotransmitters, all these stress hormones, sometimes we lose this capability of thinking clearly, thinking with our rational mind, or thinking with our neocortex, and it's like that. How do I make, like, how is it possible to reframe that in our advantage? I guess that is what we will be exploring more throughout this discussion, as to when I am stressed, I mean, I am pumped up, I am on some kind of steroid, my resources are available for, as if it's in that fight or flight mode, my resources are at my disposal, that I may get into some kind of intensive process, right? So what I'm trying to understand is, at some stage, if I'm thinking from stress, then I'm not thinking logically, which is why we try to take that step back. But here we are challenging that belief, and we are saying that, okay, it is fine to certain threshold, and this threshold, as you rightly said, that it might differ from person to person. But as a psychological practice, once we are saying take a step back from your stress, and another way we are saying that let take advantage of the stress. So how do we balance that? How do we use that in our advantage?
Exactly. So what's happening from a neuroscience perspective and neuropsychology perspective, actually, is something very interesting that you've touched upon. So when we're stressed and we go into this fight or flight, fawn or flop mode, basically it's our amygdala that takes over. So it's our limbic system that takes over. And what our amygdala likes doing is blocking our prefrontal cortex, where we have all of this logic that helps us make logical decisions, right? So the amygdala just really wants to take over, and it's like, okay, I'm in danger, I think I'm going to die now, which is you're not, because you're about to give a presentation. So the amygdala is just like, I'm going to take over right now. Then we've got your prefrontal cortex, which is the part right behind your forehead, and the prefrontal cortex hates to give up control. So the prefrontal cortex starts fighting, and you've got this fight in your mind because your prefrontal cortex is aware that you're not being chased by a lion, you're just about to give a presentation. So these two systems start fighting with each other, and you've got the amygdala saying, like, I'm in danger, I need to take over, I need to fight, flight, or pass out, basically. And then your prefrontal cortex fighting, saying, no, absolutely not. And you just end up completely overwhelmed. This is when also some people even faint. There's a complete takeover of the parasympathetic nervous system, and you just faint. So what usually helps, is reframing what's happening in your body. That's one technique. So for example, when we're talking about cognitive reappraisal, right? So it could be changing the story in your head. So let me give you an example. You are about to give a presentation. Again, this is the example that I hear most, the challenge that I hear most from students and from people that are about to give presentations, that they don't like speaking in public. So instead of thinking to yourself, I can't handle this, it could be, to start and try to feel what's happening in your body. And this is where mindfulness comes in. And then you've got the cognitive reappraisal, which would be, instead of telling yourself, I can't do this, you could tell yourself something like, my heart is pumping faster to give me energy. My stomach is fluttering because I care about doing well. That's normal. So you all of a sudden, that's your prefrontal, you allow your prefrontal cortex to kind of take over the amygdala, and you help it take over the amygdala by thinking to yourself, oh, my body is preparing me to do well. It's almost, even when you listen to the words, it gives it a different meaning. It kind of gives, you take back control, and you get out of that, I can't think logically. I'm going to make decisions that I'm going to regret later. So it's about the moment that you start understanding what's happening in your body. And again, this is just one technique. It's about, you have this cognitive reappraisal where you reframe what you're feeling and understand that what your body is doing is just trying to prepare you to do well. And all of a sudden your prefrontal cortex comes back in action and is like, okay, this is good. I need this. And you see a lot of public speakers that practice this beforehand, or they've got all sorts of little mantras that have been shown that actually have a positive impact, such as, for example, the 2-minute personal ritual. I don't know if you ever heard of that. So you've got some speakers that create, for example, a repeatable sequence before any sort of kind of nerve-wracking test. So it could be something like tapping the desk 3 times or taking a sip of water. And they start assimilating this with success. And the reason why it works is because studies have shown that it reduces anxiety immediately, because it makes you take back control, if that makes sense. So people are thinking, you trick yourself into saying that, okay, I've done my mantra, my little tapping the desk 3 times or whatever it is, and now it's going to be okay. It's such a small thing, but there's so many studies that actually show that it works, and it's just about tricking your brain. And there's many others like this.
Yeah. I've got something very similar to that. Is it became very popular during COVID, is that you're on calls all the time, and then when you are face to face with someone, and then there is a confrontation, or you don't disagree or whatever, there is a different body language and things, but over the call it's just lost. It's it's not there. So this is something my boss told me, that always keep a glass or a cup on your desk. Doesn't matter, it doesn't have to have water or any drink. Just keep it empty, and if you're cornered or if you're attacked or whatever, just pretend to drink from there. It doesn't even have to have anything. It's just that some kind of totem, like it just reminds you that you are not in danger. It's just harnessing back to your logical mind that it'll pass.
Exactly. And you know that this thing with water, actually, the reason why it works so well, because it's something that I also do when I do public speaking, it's because it's forcing you to pause. So I do real water every single time I give a lecture, single time I speak at a conference. I always have water next to me, always, all the time. And every time I ask things such as, any questions, anyone, although sometimes deep down I'm hoping that there's no questions, I take a sip of water because it forces me to stop talking and to breathe. Because unless, I'm some sort of, I want to discover gravity like a toddler, and start speaking with water in my mouth, it forces me to pause, to breathe, and to just reset and take a break. And it works wonders for me. And now I've shared this with other lecturers, and they started doing it as well. And it's almost, because of course, when we're in that fight or flight mode, we struggle implementing all of these things. It's all nice and very clear, when we talk about it now, and we're both relaxed. But when you're in that moment, it's very hard to implement and try to remind yourself, oh, I should listen to my body and blah, blah, blah. But there is a few things, such as the glass of water, for example, that forces you to reset, that forces you to stop and to breathe. And this is why when I talk about Eustress to my clients, and it's usually in a work context where they want to increase psychological safety, I give them a few techniques that they can implement in time, but also very short ones where they can change things physiologically almost instantly, that once you learn, you can use in these moments where you feel like you're becoming too stressed and you might just flop, basically.
Thanks for the practical suggestions around managing stress. And I guess that's very crucial to do this reframing, that to be able to recognize, just still use your logical brain to function at a higher capacity, let's say. And from what I've seen as sort of effects of stress on us is it comes with certain bitterness, as in that dose of stress hormones. And, we kind of get addicted to it, that we cannot survive with that. We invite that stress. And in that process, because I would not really, that I'm talking about, if we are not mindful about balancing that, relieving that, and processing that. But if we don't do that, if we keep piling on stress from time to time, we incur bitterness, because we are in that toxic cocktail, but we are consuming that more often. And now since we are talking about reframing, can I ask you, like, as a psychologist, can we make sure that we don't fall into this trap of stress, and we get that boost, that power from it, and also not succumb to its negative aspects?
That's a good point. And I guess here what I would say is, the first step always has to be awareness. If we don't have the awareness of what stress does to our bodies and where we're at, then we can't start anywhere. But of course, obviously, awareness is not enough, because you can know about it and then you don't know what to do about it. So, as I said, one of the first techniques that I would use was what we talked about earlier, which was cognitive reappraisal. So it's about changing the story in your head, which we talked about earlier a little bit. Another one, when we feel overwhelmed, and I particularly do this in my PhD, I do it personally. I tend to get very overwhelmed when I think about the big picture of what I need to produce, my thesis, and it's such a big project. So really what I found that helps, and what research says that helps, is very logical, and you hear it everywhere, but it actually works, setting clear goals and breaking tasks down. But when I mean breaking tasks down, I don't mean today I'm going to write 10 pages. No, I mean, today I'm going to wake up at this time. I'm going to get myself a coffee. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to start writing 500 words. It's to that level. The more you break it down, the more control you feel that you have over your day, and you feel less overwhelmed, because being overwhelmed usually comes from having too much to do and thinking that we can't actually take on such a big task. So it's, when I say break it down, I don't mean, as I said, breaking down in smaller chunks and that's it, you're done. No, I want you to break it down in minuscule tasks and just focus on literally the next hour of your life. That's what I mean. And you feel and stop thinking about everything else, just think about the next hour and what you do. And another thing that is related to this is the worry window. I don't know if you ever heard of the worry window or the
No.
worry hour. So it's something that we use in psychology when people go through a lot of things at the same time. You know, we all have so many things that we juggle. It can be in our personal lives, in our at work, family, relationships, everything. So a worry window is basically when you give yourself 1 hour at a specific time of day that you pick where you can worry as much as possible, as much as you want. And but not with for the other 12 hours of the day when you're awake. It's basically you say to yourself, if you start worrying at 10 a.m. in the morning, you say to yourself, no, I'm going to do this at 4 p.m. At 4 p.m. is my worry hour. And then between 4 and 5, all you do is worry. And if you want to cry, then you cry. And if you want to ruminate, then you ruminate. But once the clock hits 5 p.m. after the hour, you're done. And your next worry hour is the next day. And it's a really cool technique that therapists use a lot with their clients when they're overwhelmed, because again, it gives you structure and it gives you control. And who loves structure and control? Our prefrontal cortex. Who hates structure and control? Our amygdala. And what you want is to keep your prefrontal cortex active, not your amygdala when it comes to stress. So it's that's a very just neat technique that I love. Another one that, again, you hear a lot being said is reframing failure and seeking learning, and that's a lot easier said than done, especially when a failure becomes a threat to our ego or our identity. And this takes time. This is not one of those techniques that you be able to do from today to tomorrow. It's something where you have to do some introspection, you have to adopt this growth mindset, and it means viewing potential failures as learning opportunities. Saying that, a nice way that I like to put it is that mistakes are data, they're not disasters. So it's something that you learn from. When you start removing this kind of like do or die stakes, that we often see at work or in our personal lives, then you transform distress into eustress. The situation becomes a challenge that you can approach with curiosity rather than fear. But again, this takes time. However, this is one of the techniques that has shown to increase resilience the most, but it's also one that is the most difficult to adopt, because when we see failures and constructive, or let's just say negative feedback, a lot of the times we tend to see it as a threat, as I said, to our ego or our identities, especially at work or in our personal relationships. We know that we've tried our best a lot of the times, and you've put your whole effort into it, and then making a mistake or having a failure it is threatening. It almost feels like they're coming after you. So this is one of the ones that you would have to practice for at least 3 weeks to start seeing results, because it takes about 3 weeks to start making new neural connections in our brains. But it's also one that helps the most, to be honest.
That is wonderful. I mean, we talked about some really important aspects, especially focused on today's professional environment. I mean, I've seen people getting challenged by all this. Like, they get into the presentation, but then they don't handle that stress. They think that they are being questioned, and it invalidates their effort and honesty, the whole stress element. And I think the strategies that we talked about, I'm sure that listeners of this episode would find that really helpful. I think I went over the areas that I wanted to raise myself. Do you think we should have covered something else that we missed?
I've got two more techniques for you that I want.
Definitely. Yeah, please.
One of them is at work for leaders that want to promote psychological safety, because it's been shown that psychological safety, especially at work, is one of the main things that brings this from distress into eustress. So one of them is, I don't know if you've ever heard of this. It's called a flop meeting. Have you ever heard of that?
Okay. No.
So a flop meeting is basically a meeting. You have a meeting once a week with everyone where everyone shares their funniest mistakes that they made that week. And the winner gets a reward.
Yeah.
And you'd be surprised how well it works to take the stigma away from, oh my God, I've made the mistake, this is a disaster. When you start reframing it as something funny, as something that you've learned from, and especially when leaders start themselves sharing the mistake that they've made, then you frame it with humor rather than a disaster, then you'd be so surprised. It's like an instant switch that you see in people. So I love this concept. It's called a flop meeting, and I always give this advice to leaders. And the second one that I'd like to share is something called a physiological sigh. I don't know if you've ever heard of this concept. This is something that you do personally. So a physiological sigh is, think about when you see children or babies cry. What you notice that they do is they take a big inhale through their nose, and then they do another short sigh. So it would be something like, just like a second one. So that basically, the second one fills your lungs completely with air, and then you do that, and then you slowly breathe out through your mouth for about 6 to 8 seconds. So the physiological sigh is basically something that has been shown that it reduces your heart rate very quickly, so within 30 seconds, and it lifts your mood within minutes. And you see this again in babies, because or when someone cries, you see this two sighs, one after the other. You take air in through your nose twice, and you do, and then you push it out through your lungs. And the key here is to have the exhale longer than the inhale, because that's how you reactivate your parasympathetic nervous system, which is the calming system in your brain. And this is something that I teach many people to do, that I do myself. And there's loads of videos on YouTube and loads of research online on the physiological side for people that want to see how it actually works in practice. But it's really like one long inhale through your nose and then another short inhale to your nose. So you feel your lungs all of a sudden expand, and then a long exhale. And you do this about 3 to 5 times. And then you will see in about 30 seconds that your heart rate will fall, and you'll feel instantly better. And this is why sometimes we also feel better after crying, because that's the exact breathing that we do when we cry. And it's quite cathartic. And these were 2 techniques that I wanted to share, because I think it's really useful.
This is very interesting. I remember my daughter brought this up a couple of weeks ago. I mean, she just transferred from primary school to high school here, and then all of a sudden it's a completely new environment and schedule and challenges, etc. And she told me that she faced some moments where she can breathe, and then I was talking to her, trying to understand, and then I realized that she is just trying to breathe too fast, and that's why she's feeling that short of breath. And I told her this technique of, the breathing practice is very little, 1 second of deep breath also, it can change that, short of breath feeling into getting more accustomed to the situation. Just to, approach towards the conclusion, the other thing that I wanted to hear from you is, I was reading about the Polyvagal theory recently as a part of, I think, another podcast or something. And, it kind of feel that it explains a little bit of amount of, what we talked about in today's discussion, that the eustress bed, it says that there are different stages of motivation. I think it differentiates that eustress and distress bit with its explanation Do you think that's the case? I mean, it kind of supports what you are we discussed in this episode?
It's something that is definitely related to stress. Yes, it's one of the theories that are related to stress. A lot of it has to do with the vagus nerve. Pretty much everything that we do when it comes to emotions, when it comes to regulating our emotions, is being done mostly to the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is basically the one that activates our sympathetic nervous system versus our parasympathetic nervous system. It's the one that pumps the brakes, so it's almost like your sympathetic nervous system is always ready to go, always, and then the vagus nerve puts the brakes on it, and then you've got the parasympathetic nervous system, when we're rest and digest, and the moment that the vagus system deactivates the brake on the sympathetic nervous system, it just comes full on. And it's the nerve in our body from our brains that it has a ventral part and a dorsal part, and they both do different things. And it is indeed the physiological, it's the way that we measure this variability that we have between the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. And usually we measure the health of the vagus nerve, this brake, the power that it has, through something called heart rate variability, which is something that I'm doing in my PhD at the minute. And the higher your heart rate variability is, it shows that you've got a healthier activation of this vagus nerve, so a healthier homeostasis, basically. And it's really interesting because you see so many devices nowadays that kind of say that they measure HRV, but unfortunately, I don't want to burst anyone's bubble, but in order to actually measure HRV, you need some more measurements in the lab, and it's, your Oura Ring or your Apple Watch is not going to be very precise.
Accurate, yes.
Exactly. So, I've got a lot of people that actually, some of my clients ask me about their Oura Ring reading of HRV sometime when we talk about it. And I do have to tell them that a low HRV on your Oura reading means absolutely nothing. This is not actually how you measure HRV, and you need so many other measurements, such as salivary cortisol measurements, and there's things that go, around your chest. So you could see it as an indication, that you might need more recovery time, which can be relaxation, it could be meditation, it could be sleep, but don't take it too seriously is what I'm going to say. So if you have an Oura Ring, or if you have an Apple Watch, and it tells you that your HRV is low, don't panic. It's
the first time I read about HRV, that's the discussion I had with my brother, and we were kind of exchanging notes. And I was saying that, do you think it is possible to measure, maybe emotional intelligence through HRV? And then he said it's too far-fetched, it's just something.
It doesn't measure emotional intelligence. It's just meant to measure how your autonomic nervous system functions. But keep in mind that your autonomic nervous system also controls your heart rate, your breathing, and everything that's automatic in your body. So really, an Oura Ring HRV is not going to be able to tell you anything significant, and especially nothing such as emotional intelligence. It's just they use it as a item of recovery. If you combine it with everything else, you could say that yes, it shows you something, but on its own, I wouldn't take it too seriously.
That is spot on. I mean, yeah, I sometimes think that all these gadgets, they kind of go a little overboard and does all this information overloading, and again, de-stress probably.
Exactly. And especially if you're someone who suffers from health anxiety, that is just going to make it worse, because a person who suffers from health anxiety is not going to be, the moment that they're going to see those scores in the Aura Ring app that go down, it's not necessarily going to motivate them to be better, or it could, but there's also a chance that, because if they already have something like health anxiety, there's a chance that it will push them towards distress. They would, they start, hyperventilating even more, and they start thinking, oh my God, what if there's something wrong with me, seriously wrong with me? And I don't think it for some people it helps, for others it doesn't. But yeah, just kind of take it with a grain of salt, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. Now, thank you so much today for all your wonderful insights, and to all our listeners who joined us today. And yeah, it was great to hear about something that I've never covered in the podcast as well.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun, and I think we had such an interesting discussion, and I hope that people find it insightful.